When Brutus and his co-conspirators plotted to kill Julius Caesar on 15 March 44 BC, they thought it was an act of loyalty to the state. But they were also plotting to kill the very person they said they would give their lives to protect. Now you might wonder where I'm going with this. Tom Keene, our leader, might especially wonder where I'm going with this. I will argue, and I think the panel would support, that current HIPAA legislation has two sides to the same coin, radically different, that have interfered with it being changed for decades. On the one hand, many people, consumer groups, advocacy groups, and others, think it's a great advance forward because the government finally helped in a way it never did before, regulating privacy, controlling privacy, assuring privacy of patients and subjects and the public. But on the other hand, the research community believes not only does this not protect privacy as well as it could, but it's interfered with research aimed at saving that same group of patients, of protecting them, preventing cancer, or helping them be treated to overcome their cancer. Two different faces of the same legislation. That's why Sea Change commissioned a group over a year ago to see if we could work with others to change the HIPAA legislation to do a better job protecting privacy and to do a better job allowing researchers to do their research. Recently, a report from HHS suggests that they heard the message, and as I'll say in a few moments, they have some proposed legislation that I hope we'll all comment on that would change HIPAA regulations. They too believe that an assassination or at least an attitude change is needed in this legislation. Let me lay the groundwork and then ask the experts to come out and flesh it out. I'd like to do three things. Talk a little bit about what the Sea Change actions have been over the last year. What has the response from HHS been to these actions and actions by a lot of other people and organizations? And finally, what now should we do as an organization in response to that? The challenge was laid out nicely by an Institute of Medicine study a couple of years ago. It said clearly and had documented proof for the fact that the current legislation doesn't work either in protecting privacy maximally or in advancing research. It's important to realize that when you don't advance research, you're hurting patients. I won't go through all of the things on this slide, but let's just take the first one, selection bias. Because consent forms are so long and involved, it is more likely that undereducated poor people don't sign them and they don't agree to be in research projects. So you have a selection bias that doesn't help disparities, doesn't help the undereducated, doesn't help the poor in many of the research projects, clinical trials, and other things that are being done. And you can read through the others. We started, as you probably are aware, a bit late, so I'm going to rush through these and give more time to the experts. What has Sea Change done about this situation? It appointed 3 different committees. One was to further define the problem. The second was to identify solutions to the problem. And the third was then to try to advocate on the Hill and wherever needed to get those solutions put in place. What have they done? The group that was going to further define the problem has written a report. Allison could provide you copies or where you can get a copy of that report. It has looked at a lot of different things, one being the financial cost to patients that this legislation has caused, opportunity costs for research advancement, and so forth. In terms of defining solutions to the problem, we wanted to look at solutions that would help both researchers and patients. We partnered with a lot of other disease communities that wanted the same thing. This isn't just a cancer problem. This is a problem for all patients, all people doing research on biomedical issues, diseases. You can see there on the slide some of the programs with which we interacted. We responded to various things that were going on and developing this kinds of responses, further defining the problem, and so forth. And then we wanted to advocate for change. You can see on this slide, we've submitted public comments along with other organizations in those three things listed. We would point out, for example, that technology is wonderful, electronic medical records are wonderful, but if you don't change HIPAA legislation, they won't have the impact on patients that they might have. How this legislation affects so many other things that have much greater promise than they're going to realize because of the legislation. Recently, the HHS has issued what is called an advance notice of proposed rulemaking. They don't have to issue this. It's a notice that they're thinking of changing a rule. Whether they will change it, whether they can change it, how they will change it isn't certain, but they announce this in advance so the public can respond to it. There was a lot of interest in responding, and so they changed the deadline, extended the deadline until later this month. We don't have a lot of time, but we do have more time. The academic community, the research community didn't respond much when HIPAA legislation was put in place. Now we need to respond to make our voices known. The title of this advance notice is telling. Human Subjects Research Protections, Part 1, Enhancing Protections for Research Subjects and Reducing Burdens, Delay, and Ambiguity for Investigators, Part 2. They seem to acknowledge from the beginning that there are problems on both sides of this equation, and we've got to do something to improve them. As you'll hear, however, from the panel, this is not a panacea. Even if we commented constructively on everything that's proposed, and they took all the comments we made, everything isn't the way it needs to be. And you'll hear more about that from the panel. This panel is a group of experts. Tom has already introduced them. They all have about 5 minutes of comments prepared, so I will turn to them immediately, and because of time, just ask them to follow each other rather than wasting a few moments while I come up to the podium and introduce them. Andy, I believe you're first.
Thank you very much. You know, it's interesting. One of the best things about working with Sea Change is I think the thoughtful approach that the organization takes to really take the time necessary to figure out where the opportunity is to move to intervention. I think our history is rife with public health and health education, especially sometimes at the community level of, you know, rushing right to let's do something now because we think we know what's going on, and we spend a lot of time and energy and effort in sometimes making the problem 10 times worse because we did not take the time to really figure out what was happening, what was the right solution to put in place, and where we needed to apply our effort. So it's really a common theme I think I've seen throughout all of the panels, and I think this is another one of those opportunities where it on its surface, you know, may seem focusing on a very specific issue, but we took the time to figure out that this was so important and could be so transformative or so dangerous if left unaddressed that we needed to focus our time and attention there. I'm going to speak a little bit just about the patient perspective in all of this. So being at Livestrong, that's where we hang our hat. It's our true north, as it was said earlier. The patient, the survivor experience, the role that they play, the impact on their daily lives is where we spend our time and effort. And this is a new area for us, to be quite frank. It was one of those issues that was driven home for us as we listened to survivors talk about their frustrations with the management of their health data. I think we heard it referenced earlier. You know, it doesn't give a lot of confidence when you see your physician rifling through a bunch of papers and trying to figure out, you know, the relevant data for the management of your specific issue. But then in regards to cancer, knowing how that data is delivered to other people on your healthcare team, or how it's delivered or not in many cases to you. If you've ever had the experience of requesting your medical data from a healthcare institution to take it somewhere else to get a second opinion or to provide it to from one practice setting like oncology to primary care, it can be supremely frustrating. If you're in the throes of treatment and needing to make a change and get access to that information, like let's say during a natural disaster, it can be life-threatening. So we're hearing all the time that this issue of data and the way data is protected, the way it's made available, and the way it's used for research is supremely important to patients. So we wanted to spend some time to figure out what it is they actually thought about it. Before we waded into this field and put our time and energy towards any type of intervention, we wanted to see what patients thought. So we convened a survey very quickly online. It was a convenient sample of whomever wanted to take it. But within 3 days, we got over 10,000 responses of people who wanted to share what they believed was important in regards to electronic health information exchange. So I'm just going to share a couple of data points with you that I think will help inform where we see the patient voice in this and where we want to use that to help make some of the changes happen that we think are important. So by and large, I think we can say with confidence, based on the data that we've seen, and this has been validated, I think, with some research others have done as well, is that cancer survivors think that they should be engaged in the conversation about their health information, and they are willing to give their data in order to do so. So grant access to it so others can see it so that they can be an active part of that conversation. And specifically, I want to share a few key statistics that demonstrate this. 85% of respondents to the survey that we conducted think that their medical care would improve if healthcare providers could share data and information electronically. 94% of respondents think that it's important that healthcare professionals share patient medical information with each other electronically, and of that 94%, another 94% think that patients should be able to see that exchange of data as well. So not just have physicians exchange it in a protected pipeline, but they want to see that exchange as well. They want to see the conversation happening and how that is resulting in better care coordination on their behalf. 87% think 87% would give their anonymous medical information to scientists doing research. So they are more than willing to share this data if certain protections are put in place. When asked if information given to doctors is safely guarded in an electronic format or in a paper format, 71% said electronic data is safely guarded. 59% said that paper is safely guarded. So we can see that there's a conveyance of the perception of safety to a greater degree when data is shared electronically. And then finally, 99% want their data to be safe, secure, and confidential. So confidential is an important part because this idea of being anonymous under all circumstances, I think, is an unrealistic expectation, one, of the systems that we have created and our ability to re-identify data. But two, I think patients' expectations based on this data is that the data needs to be held confidential. It doesn't need to be open to the public, but it's not always necessary to be anonymous under all circumstances, especially if it's going to result in better quality care for themselves, but if it could be used for research purposes to improve the care for the population. So I say this in some respects, not necessarily to challenge any one specific point of view, other than the fact that up to this point, it's been our observation that some of the patient privacy advocacy that has happened to date has been very one-sided and has painted a picture of patients that are protective or invested in privacy to the exclusion of any benefit that they might receive from the sharing of their data. And what we have found is it is a much more reasonable picture in regards to basic safety and protections put in place to protect data, but yet the willingness to share data in an electronic format that could benefit not only their own care, but also the research agenda as well. So I think this is an important aspect to frame some of our conversations around the patient voice, and happy to answer questions when the panel is engaged. Thank you.
Well, we're running late. I'll try and be brief, and certainly want to hear from Fred and Donna, who have much more important things to say than I do. But Let me ask you a question. When credit card information is stolen, how many of us stop using our credit cards? A car is stolen in the United States every 26 seconds. How many of us stop driving cars? We don't. And why? It's because we are a risk-accepting society. And I think we have to recognize that that extends to all aspects of our lives, including our health, including our health information. I think that there has been an unrealistic expectation that we will have perfection when it comes to security, when it comes to health information, and that's just not reality. So we have to really ask ourselves, what's the balance between the relative value of what we seek to protect? The protection of information or the protection of research. And obviously we want both, but we're not willing to sacrifice progress in cancer research for absolute protection of our health information. So I think we have to really engage in a dialogue and understanding of where this set point is. Where's the balance? Where is the risk acceptance when it comes to privacy? And have there been any true violations that have been irreparable and as damaging as the damage we see every day from cancer? I think that we have a chance to catalyze this process now through the emergence of personalized medicine. We've been talking about this for more than a decade, but I think we can see in a number of cancers like breast cancer and lung cancer and others that we're seeing large histologic types being broken down into separate genotypes. And this is now beginning to reveal the reasons why only a fraction of patients respond to any of our therapies. It's because even though it looks like they have the same cancer under the microscope, what's driving that cancer may be vastly different from one patient to another. And by understanding that and developing therapies that target that, we're able to see response rates and cancer control rates, the likes of which we've never seen with chemotherapy. I think what that means is that one disease in which there are a large number of patients is being broken down into smaller subsets of diseases, each of which has many fewer patients. So what that means is if we're going to evaluate new therapies, new approaches, new early detection methods for these individuals, we're going to have to find them. It's not that we can recognize them by hair color or eye color or how tall they are. We will recognize them through genetic information, the most personal kind of health information. And as Andy said, and it's very consistent with my experience, cancer patients, and I think the general public, many of whom have been touched by cancer, are very willing to have this information known and shared to be able to help them and help loved ones. So we now have the ability and we now have an opportunity at this time to really call to action not only groups like ours, but patients and improving their awareness of the opportunities that stand before us to be able to benefit from these advances in understanding of cancer biology and the therapies that actually can be developed based on those insights, and really not just have us telling them this is important, but them not only asking for but demanding it. I think a lot of change occurs not because of large groups, but because of the commitment of one very dedicated individual, whether that's Lance Armstrong with the Livestrong Foundation, whether it's Betty Ford or Happy Rockefeller with breast cancer, or Harvey Fierstein with AIDS and ACT UP, or childhood abduction with the Amber Alert, or the American Childhood Cancer Organization with Ruth Hoffman. These are grassroots organizations. These are organizations that are started because people want something that they feel they deserve and they don't have that's very vitally important to their health, to their well-being, to their lives. And I think that may be the missing element here. We hear about policy, we hear about how we all agree this is something that's important and we should do, but we're not seeing that progress. And I think it's because we're trying to push something when really what's going to cause it to come true is when it's pulled. And that pull will only happen when the people who are affected, not only those who have cancer, but those who may get cancer, which is basically everyone, recognizes the importance of this and demands that this exchange of information occur. So in closing, I think that we have the opportunity to really move forward in this area. The changes start with you and with us, but not wearing our organization or university or corporate hat, but us as a grassroots movement that really demands this change. Thank you very much.
To lawyers that are batting cleanup today, I hope you won't also quote classics out of context and say, first we kill all the lawyers. That's only if you want anarchy. Please read the whole thing in order to make sure that you know where you're going. But I must say that a lot of the problems that we're facing and we're trying to address in this particular initiative have been brought about by lawyers, or more particularly by imperfect communication among lawyers and the people who are wanting a better legal protection for patient privacy. For more than 2 decades, we've been taking sophisticated research science and patient advocates to members of Congress to talk about the need for better protections to ensure that we are taking care of patients' privacy at the same time that we're facilitating research, and we just can't seem to get it right. And today, as I was sitting in the break hour out on the bench catching up with email, I saw a brilliant new initiative announced by the FDA. And it embodies exactly why we're having such a hard time getting it right. Everybody agrees we don't want to mess up research from the beginning. None of the lawyers who've been drafting, nobody wants to mess up research. Everybody wants research to be facilitated. None of the researchers want to jeopardize patient privacy and sell their data on the internet or do ugly things to that. Everybody has compatible and comparable goals. This initiative today that FDA announced, it was a big press release by Secretary of HHS and also by the Commissioner of the FDA. Blueprint for innovation, speeding our innovations to market to provide better care for patients. Really lovely initiative. It's very compatible with a lot of what we've been talking about here at the Sea Change meeting. But when you dig down in, what's the one big thing they're proposing to do? They're proposing to create a massive electronic database of all the clinical trial data they have from all the studies that have been done. They're all de-identified. They're all anonymous. So as Andy says, they would meet the criteria. These are people who gave consent to be in trials and for their data to be used in research. They're going to put that data together, and they're going to put it together with all of the adverse event reporting data that we get under the Sentinel program and all of the risk evaluation and management protocols, and make it available in a very secure form for enclaves of researchers to do targeted data mining of old trial data to take advantage. I mean, this has already been expensively collected data. These are data that patients willingly made available as part of their informed consent process. Why not mine it to develop much faster innovations? Perhaps look for the kinds of things that Mace is talking about, where we can further segment trial populations from old clinical trials down into smaller groups of responders who look this way versus that, and then at least get a leg up on where we're going to go. Trouble is, the same Secretary Sebelius and Commissioner Hamburg issued the advance notice of proposed rulemaking that Tom told us about as we started, right? And in the advance notice of proposed rulemakings, one of the things that they proposed in order to fix a really big problem that we have, and which was very, very adequately described and ideally described in the IOM report, one of the solutions they proposed would make that illegal. So here we go again, right? Everybody is wanting to do the right thing, but we can't quite get it right, right? It sounds so good. And so now, in the proposal is that, oh, of course you can let patients give consent for future research, which has been prohibited under the current rule. Of course you can do that. That's the proposal to fix it. But of course, at the same time, then they say, but you can't let researchers use data that was collected under one consent when anonymized for another purpose. You've got to go back and ask the patient, or you've got to have thought in advance to ask the patient up front. So I don't know when we're going to get it right, but it's why I'm so pleased to be working with Sea Change, because if anybody can do it, it's a broader coalition of people who have the breadth of perspective to bring it all together. And that's why I'm glad to be on the same dais with my colleague, Fred Kay.
Well, I am delighted to be here, and especially on such a remarkable panel. I'm trying to think what my job is, and I just realized it's to pick up the dirty water glasses when the panel is over, because my colleagues have done such a good job covering these issues. I think there are just a couple of points I'd like to touch on, and being alert to the time, I will do so very briefly, even though it's against my nature as a lawyer to do anything briefly. One is, I think we really are now at the point we need a serious dialogue about consent and the role of consent, because so far to date, HHS has made a determination that the only basis for privacy protection it can think of is consent. And therefore, we end up re-consenting people over and over again. You go in for treatment, you have to consent for the data to be collected then. The data is used for a study, you have to consent again. But for it to be used for another study, you have to consent again. And at some point, we need to draw a line and say, particularly once you remove the name and other readily identifying information, data that's collected in an environment of consent ought to be able to be reused in productive, appropriate, protected ways without having to keep reconsenting every time. But this is going to be a fight, and it's going to be a fight in state legislatures, and it's going to be a fight certainly in the Capitol here, because we always come back to consent, and in many settings, consent's entirely appropriate. But remember, we're not talking about touching the patient again. We're not collecting new data again. We're talking about data that has already been collected at enormous expense under a consent regime, being used for a study that has been approved by an IRB, so is subject to ethical and legal oversight. In that setting, it seems like we are going to have to move as a nation to be willing to say, if all of those protections are in place, it's time to say we don't need a third or a fourth or a fifth bite at the consent apple again. Now, the second point is the ANPRM, which has been discussed here, is in many ways great news, because it really does talk about simplifying and streamlining the research process, and particularly the role that IRBs serve in that process. But in it, it has this sort of sting in the tail, if you read to the end, which almost nobody does. And that is, it deals with this problem, which Donna highlighted, which the IOM addressed so clearly, and that is we currently have different privacy protection regimes under the common rule, which governs research that involves federal money or most other research in this country if it involves human subjects, and under the HIPAA privacy rule. Those are inconsistent. If you're a researcher, or heaven forbid, if you're a patient involved in that situation, you're going to get approached twice with inconsistent consent documents. So everyone has said, let's get together, let's get on one page, and without exception, every recommendation of the more than dozen that we have seen from extremely well-established groups, including the IOM, has been moved to the common rule model. So what has HHS proposed? Moving to the HIPAA model, getting rid of the common rule approach and instead using the more restrictive approach of the HIPAA privacy rule. And so if there is one practical thing that we need to be doing urgently, it's making sure that that proposal doesn't move forward. Whatever else replaces it, we might still have a lively conversation about. But what we don't want to do is make the situation worse. Now, there is good news, and that is because of that pending rulemaking, because of the FDA notice, because of a general awareness in Washington that we have now spent over $40 billion on electronic health records, which cannot be used for research because of the federal privacy rule. The time is right. If ever there's been a moment in the past decade since the privacy rule came into effect to try to address this head on, that time is now. And this is precisely the type of approach, this broad consortium approach led by Sea Change, that I think is most likely to have an effect. So Tom, back to you.
Thank you. Tom, do we have time for any questions, or do you want it done afterwards? We have some time? Good. While people are thinking of a question, Fred talked about the urgency of saying something, of responding. Allison Sea Change will send you Sea Change's response and the electronic address, the URL, or you could send your response, either as head of an organization or as individuals or both. But we do need the response. So to help you, Sea Change will talk about the points that it thinks need responding to, and if you would like to respond, here's the URL. Please send your response in. And that should come soon. As you know, the October 26th deadline is right around the corner. Questions? When you have such good presentations, nothing remains to be asked.
I think what they're trying to say is nothing remains to be said.
Well, the speakers will be here afterwards if you think of something you'd like to ask them. Thank you very much for a wonderful panel.